The Doom of the Haunted Opera by John Bellairs and Brad Strickland, Chapter 16. The following Saturday, Rose Rita, Mrs. Jagger, and Mrs. Zimmerman all came to visit Jonathan and Louis in the mansion on High Street. They had milk and some of Mrs. Zimmerman's wonderful walnut fudge cookies, and they sat on lawn furniture in the backyard because the weather had turned sunny and warm. The grass was beginning to show hints of green, and fresh buds had popped out in all the trees. The air had a wonderful scent of growing things. Spring had arrived at last. "Well," said Jonathan as he finished his milk, "I suppose I had better start. First, you will be happy to hear that the Capernaum County Magician Society has all returned from Goony Land, or wherever it was that Vanderhelm sent them. I've talked to everyone in the society, and the story is always the same. Each one was trapped in his or her house by that horrible fog, just the way New Zebedee was trapped." "But they're all magicians. Couldn't any of them use a spell to escape?" asked Rose Rita. No, answered Mrs. Zimmerman, "because years ago old Vanderhelm worked out a particularly potent enchantment. You see, sometimes a magician can counter a spell that another magician has cast, but that requires both power and knowledge. One thing you have to know to fight a spell is just who cast it, and everyone in the society believed that Vanderhelm had died years ago, so they never even thought of him as the one responsible." Louis, who felt recovered from his series of frights, said, "I thought Vanderhelm had died a long time ago. I thought he perished in a magical duel with Louis Mickleberry." Jonathan made a wry face. "That's what we all believed, Louis. Unfortunately, it was only partly true. As it turns out, Vanderhelm locked something of himself, namely, his insane wish to be king of the dead, in a spell that brought to life a phantom duplicate of himself. A duplicate made up of the music that carried the spell. That creature was what you were up against." Mrs. Zimmerman smiled at Louis. "And in case you were wondering if you were responsible for bringing the monster to life, Louis, the answer is a big fat no. You see, when a wizard expires, his active spells are broken. Lucius Mickleberry must have placed some kind of spell on Vanderhelm, maybe even after the wizard's duel was over. Perhaps he suspected that old Yowl and Howl had left behind some nasty little surprise. If the spell placed on the music sheet had been complete when the real Vanderhelm died, you see, it could not have been broken, but Lucius's protective spell would have kept the duplicate from coming to life, at least until Lucius himself passed away." "Well," sighed Mrs. Jagger, "at least all this uproar is over, even though some people from the outside world are laughing at New Zebedee for getting lost in a spring fog. Everything turned out all right." "Not everyone is laughing," Rose Rita said. "Ever since my uncle drove him back into town, Grandpa Galway has been pretty suspicious of what's going on. He swears there's more to the story than anyone will tell him. It's funny how no one remembers anything about the opera." "Not so funny at all, Rose Rita," answered Jonathan. "Magic has a way of doing that. The main thing is that no one associated with that ridiculous opera can remember a single line of the music. That means Vanderhelm's spell is broken forever. To tell you the truth, I think all the actors and musicians feel foolish about the whole thing. Mrs. White at the school is putting it all down to some bizarre form of spring fever. It's best to let the good folks of New Zebedee think they just went a little goofy after a long, hard winter. So we'll leave it at that." Mrs. Jagger nodded and said, "I suppose the old theater will be sealed up?" "Nonsense," said Mrs. Zimmerman in her brisk voice. "The curse is lifted, just as the fog around the town is lifted. And with the bones of poor old Mordecai Finster decently laid to rest in Oak Ridge Cemetery, no ghost will haunt the Opera House from now on. The theater will be absolutely harmless. In fact, I'm going to suggest the next meeting of the Board of Education that the auditorium be turned over to the school. They have needed a place for pageants and plays for years, and it would fit the bill perfectly." Louis sighed. "I was petrified of Mr. Finster's ghost," he admitted. "But he only wanted to help me. I hope his spirit is at rest now." "I think so, Louis," said his uncle. "A ghost can rest when its purpose has been fulfilled on earth. And just to make sure that nothing like that will ever happen again, some friends of mine and I went over and filled poor Mordecai's cell with cement." At any rate, said Mrs. Jagger, "it's all finished. I'm happy I could help in a small way." Jonathan's deep laughter boomed through the yard. "Ha, ha, ha, ha! Small way? Well, I'll admit that Louis and Rose Rita made Vanderhelm's defeat possible when they became music critics, hinting that the nasty creature hitting the nasty creature right in his vanity worked like a charm, and let us counteract his magic. Still, Mildred, you were the hero of the hour. Shall we tell her, Fizzywig? Mrs. Zimmerman's eyes sparkled with mischief. I suppose so, Fuzzy Mug. After all, the meeting is tonight. With a broad smile, Jonathan said, Mildred to be elected to membership of the Capernaum County Magician Society, you have to prove yourself by working out a real magic spell all by yourself. I got it by eclipsing the moon, and Pruny Face here, well, that's another story. Anyway, your success with the mirror and the light spells demonstrates that you qualify. I've talked to all the other magicians, and they've agreed. Congratulations, you are the newest member of the Capernaum County Magician Society. Mrs. Jager's hands flew to her cheeks. She blushed with pleasure and embarrassment. Oh, dear, she said, I don't know what to say. Don't say anything, Mildred, Mrs. Zimmerman told her. Just come to the meeting tonight. We'll have the formal ceremony then. I've never been to a meeting like that before. Oh, dear, what shall I wear? Mrs. Jager asked. Jonathan smiled. Oh, anything you wish, he said. Be casual, be comfortable, and be yourself. But one thing, he broke off, his eyes growing round with alarm. What's that? Lewis's heart thudded. A piping, eerie music filled the air, a haunting, faraway tune that was growing louder by the second. Everyone leaped up and stared at the corner of the house. A second later, Jailbird the cat sauntered around the house into the backyard. He was singing Buffalo Gals so badly it sounded like a funeral dirge. Mrs. Jager looked pained. At least, she said, I'm not as terrible as a magician, as whoever enchanted that poor cat. Mrs. Zimmerman began to laugh. Uncle Jonathan turned a bright pink, and then he chuckled too. Looking pleased with himself, Jailbird finished his tune and began to wash his paws as Mrs. Jager, Rose Rita, and Lewis joined in the laughter. It was a good sound, a lively sound, in the warm sunshine of the first real day of spring. That's the end of chapter 16. The next Bellairs book is The Hand of the Necromancer, which I still need to order. Now, I think I mentioned this in my video on The Vengeance of Witchfinder. The first time that I read that book, I thought there was a big plot hole, which was that the maze rearranged itself, and yet that wasn't paid off. But I also feel like I noticed a big plot hole in this book, which was that Rosarita's grandfather, Galway, had a photograph supposedly taken with Vanderhelm, and Vanderhelm is not in the picture, which would imply that there was more weird sorcery going on before he was killed, like that he was a vampire or something, and I wish that had been paid off a little bit more instead of him just after the fact being the ghost of the music. But still a fun read. I'm glad so many people came to listen and enjoy it, and we will see you again in the next read aloud.